Spain awakened the morning after his death, as if the house had shifted an inch on its foundations. The bells were not only for a king, they were for the furniture being pushed against the doors. Christina, now regent by signature and temperament, stood at a desk that had hosted so many arrangements and tried to govern a nation with paper that smelled of wax and crisis. Isabella toddled in adjacent rooms, a child whose toys had titles. Outside, the Carlist weather gathered itself into March. Oaths at altars, musters in farmyards, rumors crossing mountains more quickly than couriers could. War is a public thing, but it begins inside people. The men who rode out in the First Carlist War carried not only muskets and family banners, they carried stories about the dead king told in kitchens and barracks, that God had punished Spain for tolerating deformity in power, that a daughter could not inherit what a father had never rightly exercised, that the palace's secrecy required blood to rinse it. Priests who loved tradition more than mercy put piety on the side of Don Carlos and called it orthodoxy. In taverns, jokes that had once been whispered about cushions stiffened into doctrine. The very vocabulary of Ferdinand's private rooms, supports, protocols, peepholes, slid into metaphors for governance. What a sovereign hides, a country eventually fights about. Christina answered, as she had always answered, by organizing daylight. She gathered moderates and provincial notables, colonels who preferred rank to romance, lawyers who could sew statutes into garments that would not tear in battle. She placed careful men in offices that looked dull and proved crucial: supply, roads, post. She measured her enemies not by the volume of their denunciations, but by the number of carts they could move across a pass in winter. When bishops pressed her with genealogies, she returned to them parishes, bread, priests, the right to bury in sanctified ground, as if logistics were theology by other means. The nurseries order, bells at known hours, milk accounted for, had become a template for a regency at war. In this atmosphere, the myth-making began in earnest. Death makes a man available to strangers. Physicians who had signed their names to careful euphemisms found themselves denounced as conspirators in pamphlets that mixed truth with appetite. A junior clerk sold to a bookseller an inventory of palace purchases: hinges, bolts, particular leathers, and a broadsheet published it as if it were a confession. A foreign periodical, priding itself on knowing what Madrid would not say, printed a paragraph about specimens sealed beyond the Pyrenees, and a generation later, a nephew of that periodical's editor swore he had seen the drawings locked in a Roman cabinet, neat as engravings in a medical atlas, and no less indecent for their cleanliness. It is possible that such drawings existed. It is also possible that they were the hallucination of Europe's favorite pastime, peering through other people's curtains. The palace had certainly commissioned anatomical memoranda, sober, minimal, exactly as cruel as accuracy often is. The church had certainly sequestered papers that mixed confession with diagnosis, partly to spare the living and partly to spare the dead the indignity of being turned into posters. What passes down to us is a braid of files and fables, each tightening the other. A physician's sketch covered by a folded sheet, a valet's remembered stain, a cardinal's marginal note that reads only non expedite, not advisable. Facts needn't be more numerous than insinuations. They only need to be stubborn. Meanwhile, Spain bled in patterns that would be recognizable in another century, to every country that divides itself over the question of inheritance disguised as principle. Villages took oaths and then took them again. A bridge important to no one except the battalion trying to cross it became the most important fact on a given Tuesday. Christina signed warrants and pensions and the first of a long series of decrees that tried to make the law keep pace with horses. She held councils with men who had learned to distrust palaces and left them believing that a woman whose voice did not shake could be a decent substitute for certainty. She learned to count guns and to count days until the next tax conscription, the next harvest, the next thaw. The rumors did not slow. They seldom do when a story offers two pleasures at once: condemnation of a tyrant and the erotic thrill of knowledge about forbidden rooms. A pamphleteer in Paris published, under the cover of philosophy, a little dialogue in which reason and Spain argue over whether a malformed king could ever be the instrument of providence. The conclusion, delivered with the smugness of men who have never had to clean linen after difficult nights, was that nature had issued a veto and Spain had disobeyed. Another pamphlet, smuggled into Madrid in the false bottom of a music merchant's trunk, recounted the tale of the Vatican vault as if it were an allegory, the organ of tyranny preserved as a relic of misrule. The clever thought themselves braver for reading it. The devout burned such pages and then described them to each other with more heat than the fire had given. Christina understood that reputation fights alongside infantry. She did not attempt to erase the stories. Lies breed on the scrubbed floor as easily as on the filthy one. She counter-programmed them with acts. She walked into churches where Carlist whispers rustled like cassocks and left the parish poor-fed. She sent a physician to a village whose priest had thundered against the pragmatic and let the same priest bless the new well. She insisted that widows' stipends be paid on time, even when soldiers' pay was delayed by mud. She taught the capital to experience, in its bones, that law can feel like care. It did not silence the vitriol. It made it lonelier. The files thickened anyway. A committee of moralists proposed a ban on obscene satire that would have included half the ballads sung within earshot of the palace kitchen. A minister drafted a counter-memorandum arguing that prohibitions make advertisements. He used the elegant Latin of political hygiene and won the argument for a month. After a particularly lurid broadsheet appeared, engraving of a casket and a suggestive ribbon, a police magistrate overruled him, and for a while you could be questioned in Madrid for knowing a poem by heart. Nothing is so dangerous to tired governments as cleverness. Nothing is so resilient as a joke people need. And yet, alongside the bile, you could see another kind of story rooting itself, the sober accounting of what misrule had cost. A young jurist lectured students on the habit of secrecy as a constitutional vice. A doctor in a provincial academy presented a paper on the psychology of humiliation as a public danger. How a man taught too early to control rooms becomes, if he is given power, a builder of rooms large enough to hold a nation. A veteran, missing 2 fingers, told his grandson that kings who demand to be watched become men who watch, and that watching cannot be a policy without turning into a prison. From such sentences come new languages. In the quieter hours of the Regency, when dispatches slept and drums paused, Christina let memory do its arithmetic. She had been the last to learn Ferdinand's methods and the first to disarm them, room by room. She ordered the peepholes sealed, The locksmith filled the brass eyes with solder, then wood, then paint. She kept the bell at the headboard. Bells are honest. But sent the articles to a storeroom where they could rest under sheets like irrelevant furniture. The taster's right was returned to its old ceremonial proportion. Meals resumed the ordinary miracle of being eaten while still hot. In a hallway that had once been a listening post, she placed a cradle for foundlings. Servants, superstitious and grateful, began to call the corridor the passage of beginnings. Not everything could be remade. Files do not forget. Rooms remember uses. Anterooms grow accustomed to human hearts hovering at thresholds. But the palace changed its sound. The hinges returned to the register of wood. The secret stairs, no longer patrolled by frightened imaginations, creaked again like honest joints. Nurses laughed too loudly, and then, realizing no one would shush them, laughed again. The apparatus had not been destroyed. It had been converted from an idol into a storage problem. That is a small revolution. Small revolutions, multiplied, are the only ones that last. Far away from Madrid, a scholar in Rome wrote to a colleague that he had seen, or almost seen, or expected someday to see, the sealed parcel everyone gossiped about. Perhaps he had. Perhaps he had not. He made, however, a shrewd observation, one of those sentences that survive longer than the objects they describe. What is preserved, he wrote, is never only what is preserved. He meant the specimen. He meant Spain. He meant the way Europe keeps small boxes of other people's grief and calls the act learning. The letter, creased from travel, sat for years in a drawer and then drifted into footnotes like a leaf into a stream. In Spain, the war learned new geographies. Valleys that had been used to smuggling salt learned to smuggle news. Songs written in one province arrived in another, wearing different rhymes in the same rage. Christina signed and signed and signed. Some nights, when the city's dogs were the only voices answering the watchman, she stood in the Queen's oratory and asked the most untheatrical question a ruler can pose. What can be left alone? Men trained by calamity trust action to the point of superstition. She had seen how action, multiplied without mercy, becomes the very tyranny it swears to prevent. Leaving alone is not negligence if it is chosen. As the Regency matured, the legend of Ferdinand hardened, as legends do, into a set of convenient morals. Absolutists told it as a tragedy of insulted sovereignty. Liberals told it as a parable about institutions built to withstand the weather of individual weather. Satirists kept the cushions and the straps alive because laughter travels faster than footnotes. Pious people who had prayed through every bulletin preferred to remember a man whose piety was sincere and whose fear was fatal. Physicians remembered the patient whose dignity outlived ease. Artisans remembered invoices and a silence paid for in coin. Servants remembered doors. And the children? They learned a simpler version because children deserve mercy. Isabella grew up inside rooms that had been taught a new shyness. She learned to walk without tripping over the old furniture of other people's anxieties. She learned that bells can ask for help rather than signifying disaster. She learned to sleep with gossip on the far side of the wall rather than pressed like a cold spoon against the hinge. The country would one day judge her harshly or kindly according to its own needs. But for the moment, the nursery's order was a separate piece. A story that begins with a physician standing very still at the foot of a bed must return to him. Years later, the old court doctor, older now, hands less steady, Faith Morso, wrote 3 sentences for the private archive no minister would read. He confessed that he had preserved things he wished he had not, that he had named things that might have been better left to God, and that, if mercy is a science, then science must sometimes be merciful enough to stop. He sealed the paper without a signature. Perhaps someone opened it. Perhaps it still waits in a desk that will be dusted tomorrow and tomorrow again. Spain did not become easy. Nations seldom do after wars of principle that were also wars of property and kinship. But the country acquired a resistance to the charm of apparatus. It remembered that rooms can only govern when people permit rooms to speak for them. In time, the joke about peepholes lost its sting because the peepholes had been plugged. The joke about cushions grew stale because newer scandals demanded fresher upholstery. What lingered was the warning beneath all the talk of curiosities in cabinets. That private shame can be conscripted into public policy, and that the cost is counted in more than linens and letters. The palace slept better. The city, still poor and often angry, learned to live through mornings without checking the sky for fire. In chancelleries abroad, the packages moved along their dusty orbit. Reports, drawings, letters, receipts, each stamped with a seal, whose wax had outlasted the hands that pressed it. And in Madrid, sometimes, a very old servant passing an old door would touch the place where the peephole had been, and smile, not at scandal remembered, but at the quiet miracle of a hole filled. Years file the edges off a scandal until it fits in a drawer. After 1833, the palace mastered the domestic arts of forgetting. Draperies changed, chambers reassigned, a carpenter sent to take careful measurements where locks once spoke louder than speeches. Madrid preferred fresher outrages, bread, taxes, promotions, with the impatience of a city that survives by rapidly changing the subject. But time does not erase, it edits. What remained, even as the Regency steadied its hand, was the grammar Ferdinand had forced on everyone who breathed near him. The belief that if you control enough apparatus, you can domesticate anything, including destiny. The files, those stubborn fossils of policy, kept the old weather under glass. There were memoranda on security, with the same calm verbs once applied to pillows and straps. Adjust, moderate, prevent. There were inventories of hinges ordered in lots that read like artillery. There were physicians' notes that had learned to keep their nouns small and their adjectives smaller. And, somewhere beyond the palace's reach, there were packets abroad, letters, sketches, inventories, circling chancelleries like faint moons, each persuading their readers that they alone were in the know. Knowledge is a currency. Secrecy is its gold standard. In Rome, an archivist unlocks a modest cabinet with the humility of a man who knows paper can set rooms on fire. He is not a conspirator. He is a clerk with careful hands. There are envelopes inside, wax impressed with seals whose owners have long since met their God. One bears a summary in a fine 19th century Italian hand, Osservazioni su un caso regale, observations on a royal case. The archivist straightens his glasses and does what good custodians do. He notes the date, confirms the catalog, and does not read. Rules are also a kind of mercy. In Madrid, a different clerk, the kind who learns history by stalking it through corridors, parades his knowledge at a cafe table. He claims his cousin once cleaned a room, that once stored a box, that once held something that, if revealed, would cause Europe to gasp. His audience of students lean in as if the table itself, issues indulgences for proximity. A veteran at the next table, missing 2 fingers from a war, the boys reduced to slogans, mutters into his wine that secrets are just debts payable with interest. He pays for his glass and leaves before anyone can ask him who set the rates. Christina learns to govern the temperature of rumor the way she governs the temperature of rooms. A law here, a pardon there, a public kindness when the city is thirsty for spectacle. She does not waste breath denying what appetite has attached to Ferdinand's ghost. Instead, she changes the subject with a discipline that would have impressed a Jesuit. Schools, roads, the royal statute, and then, under pressure, a constitution. Paper acts that argue, without shouting, that rooms matter less than rules. Ministers discover that readiness briefings now include livestock counts and bridge repairs instead of kitchen gossip about peepholes. The shift is not grand enough to win poems. It is large enough to make habits. Meanwhile, the First Carlist War seasons the country in old ways. Villages learn, again, to bury in the morning and argue in the afternoon. Generals discover that mountains hold grudges. Officers memorize names, Zumalacárigi, Espartero, that will rule tavern talk for years. Ballads travel faster than proclamations, and some still slide slyly from battlefield to bedchamber, keeping alive the cruel couplet that made the king's body a metaphor for the state's deformity. A priest with more pity than zeal refuses to sing it at a wedding feast. He tells the fiddler to play a hymn instead, and shrugs when the groom complains that hymns do not dance. It would be more satisfying, perhaps, to say that science rescued this story from superstition, that physicians ultimately spoke with such clarity they tamed rumor into medicine. They tried. In provincial academies, earnest men gave lectures on Peyronie's disease and hypospadias, on hormonal storms that could distort flesh into parables, on the mind's weather when the body's map refuses to match the world's. They spoke gently of shame as pathology and of mercy as a regimen. A few pamphlets translated their caution into ridicule, because ridicule is cheaper than study. Still, the words leaked outward, and some fathers, hearing them, told their sons a kinder version of jokes they had memorized in their own unkind youth. The old physician, who had once stood at the foot of a royal bed and chosen sentences like bandages, outlived the first Carlist volleys and retired to a house whose garden knew more about order than any council. He kept a box, not of instruments. He had learned to hate their poetry, but of letters, condolences that had cost nothing, thank yous that had cost someone the courage to sign. His own drafts of memoranda never sent. In one unsent page he wrote, "We preserved because we were asked. We should have prayed to be refused." He folded it and placed it among the rest, as if hiding might transmute guilt into record. A young queen grew into corridors that had been taught to be shy. Isabella learned to read with tutors who, for the first time in that house, were instructed to praise accuracy over obedience. She learned that maps have scales, that Spain has provinces that disagree with one another for reasons older than any bourbon. She learned the word constitution before she learned the etiquette of picking up a fan. The palace, still a palace, never a monastery, breathed easier when the bell over the bed was used for summoning tea. The bell's tiny tongue, once darkened by panic, brightened with use. Far from palaces, the Vatican did what vaults do, kept. Historians begged politely and were let in, or not according to calendars and courtesies older than their questions. Some came out with notes. Some came out with expressions that made their colleagues more credulous than any citation could. Some came out having discovered that the past is a charity with too many petitioners and not enough alms. One scholar, careful, secular in the way careful people are, published a footnote that said only, certain materials pertaining to Ferdinand VII remain restricted. Nothing in them would comfort anyone. It sounded like a reprimand addressed to curiosity itself. Curiosity refused the reprimand. In Paris, a medical journal of ambition printed a summary by an anonymous observer in Spain describing extreme curvature, differential girth, and psychic consequences of conjugal impossibility. The tone pretended clinical calm. The piece smelled faintly of perfume. Spanish physicians, exasperated, wrote rejoinders reminding readers that diagnostics are not entertainment and patients are not monsters. The rejoinders were less widely read. Outrage never circulates as efficiently as appetites. Christina aged into the work with the competence of people who do not confuse theater with power. She could not banish zealotry, so she balanced it. She could not abolish the reflex to watch, so she reduced the number of things that needed watching. She taught young ministers that secrecy is a tax you pay with trust, and that governments low on trust should be stingy with secrets. When a minor scandal flared over a minister's private vice, she insisted on a public inquiry instead of a private purge. The city, surprised into respect, learned that daylight, even when cruel, leaves fewer ghosts. Every legend wants a vigil. Now and then, in Madrid, someone proposes an expedition to find the truth, to demand of Rome or Paris the unveiling of that which has been kept tenderly unseen. The proposals gather signatures and dust and then drift back into talk. The wiser among the petitioners begin to sense that exhumation is not the same as understanding. A body can be measured. A century must be weighed. Weighing takes longer and is less gratifying than outrage. It is also the only work that lasts. In a narrower sense, the physician's first image, lamplight on silk, a sovereign stillness, instruments arranged like a prayer, never entirely leaves Spain's imagination. Writers return to it, as we have, because it concentrates a truth prose seldom can, that a nation's structure can be forced to impersonate a person's need, and vice versa. The horror is not that palaces possess devices. The horror is that devices, once blessed with enough fear, begin to govern. By the late 1830s, with fires banked and treaties signed, the Convenio de Vergara gestures toward peace. Men shake hands, whose fingers have learned more about triggers than pens. Christina survives the first act of Regency and walks into the next with the composed fatigue of someone who has made a country breathe by insisting on ordinary hours. In the nursery, a child practices her signature. In a garden, the old doctor traces with a cane the line of a path that refuses to be straight and thinks, without bitterness now, that not everything can be made so. And somewhere, because somewhere always exists in stories like this, a drawer remains closed. Inside may be drawings, or gossip arranged into diagrams, or nothing at all. The content matters less than the gesture. We close drawers to convince ourselves that the dead can be kept from overruling the living. It is an honorable superstition. Sometimes it even works. The lesson the palace learned takes longer to reach the plaza, and longer still to reach the provinces, but it travels. Apparatus is never a substitute for mercy. Secrecy is not a synonym for care. A sovereign afraid of laughter will eventually build a state afraid of speech. Spain's sorrow under Ferdinand can be told as a salacious anecdote or as a stern parable. The anecdote is quicker. The parable is useful. If you visit the old rooms now, a guide with a voice suited to corridors will tell you about portraits and tapestries and the day a general bowed where a favorite used to sit. No one will point out a patched section of wall unless you ask. If you do ask, the guide may smile and say, "Old houses have old eyes," and pass on. It is enough. The rest you already know. Some eyes were sealed, some habits too. That is history's closest approach to healing. Not erasure, not exposure, but the right number of doors left open and the right number left shut. In the end, the physician's first task and the regent's last share, a verb: preserve. One preserved flesh because he was told it would help learning. The other preserved possibility because a country needed mornings more than it needed monuments. Between them lies a century's argument about what to keep, what to carry forward, and what to bury so that the living can breathe. We have tried, in telling this, to keep what helps breathing. The silk sheets were laundered 1,000 times. The bolts came loose and were replaced. The hinge oil dried, and dust swallowed it. The bell at the headboard hung quiet over beds, where people finally slept without listening for steps. And if you put your ear to a certain stretch of painted wall on a quiet afternoon, you will not hear a king's breath or a queen's prayer. You will hear the simple hush of plaster doing its honest work, keeping inside separate from out, letting speech happen where speech belongs, and refusing to make a nation out of a night. It is tempting to end with the sealed drawer and the quieted bell, to let the curtain fall where rooms seem finally to have learned their manners. But history seldom agrees to be dismissed on a line about healing. Isabella grew, and with her growth, the country remembered that infancy is a truce, not a treaty. The First Carlist War guttered toward compromise. Vergara's handshake made peace look possible, but the coal stayed hot. Spain entered the 1830s afterlight with the same ingredients it had carried through the storm: soldiers who liked politics, priests who liked maps, lawyers who liked hymns, and a palace that had at last unlearned one kind of watching only to be taught another. The haute cour, regency, became a relay. Christina managed the first lap with the competence of a woman who had learned to oxygenate a palace. Then came Espartero, the general with a reputation like a banner, hero to some, blasphemy to others. The handover was not gracious. Crowds performed the old sport of pulling down one face to raise another. Editors measured out courage in their columns like salt. The Queen Mother sailed into exile, then hovered at the edges like weather. Through it all, the child queen rehearsed that most exhausting ritual, growing up in public. In the Yasar 1840s. As Isabella approached majority, the rooms that had incubated her caution opened into a world impatient with caution. The palace's mortar remembered to hold. The streets remembered to fart, test. What by then had become of Ferdinand's legend? It had traveled. Satirists repurposed it whenever a minister tried to govern by bolt and key. Caricatures of cabinets sprouting spy holes, parodies of decrees written in the vocabulary of supports and Mari apparatus. Physicians, eager to keep their art from turning into gossip, published sober treatises on deformities varieties and the necessity of cash privacy, core in medicine. Priests, who had once thundered about divine displeasure, discovered that sermons about moral prudence filled pews more faithfully than sermons about vengeance. In cafes, The old verses lingered the way smoke does, in cloth and hair, faint and argumentative, less a song than a pretext for a quarrel someone wanted to have anyway. The Vatican kept its seals. Requests arrived with courtesies sharpened to points. Replies returned with courtesies dulled by habit. Somewhere in Rome, a clerk, younger than the scandal, whose papers he guarded, entered another line in a ledger. Consulted, deferred, non expedite. The legend fattened on these refusals. Men in Parisian salons twirled it on their tongues as an hors d'oeuvre of Spain's exotic backwardness. Men in Madrid, tired of being served as anyone's anecdote, learned to shrug. The wiser among them developed a professional boredom about the box. They had bridges to repair and conscripts to feed. Cabinets with ghosts do not keep roads from washing out in spring. But the match habits Ferdinand bequeathed. Those survived with shapeshifter's skill. You could see them decades later whenever a minister tried to solve a political problem with carpentry. A new police bureau with a doorway cut where a window had been. A censorship board with an appetite for adjectives. A colonel who proposed that discipline in the square could silence hunger in the Sandler market. Each time, the country's immune system, trained painfully in those long years, produced a fever. Newspapers smuggling blank spaces as eloquence, city councils mishearing orders, officers discovering that regiments marched better behind bas pay than behind metaphysics. The state still watched. The watched had learned to watch back. Isabella's court learned to calibrate intimacy and institutions. With a precision that might have impressed her father, had precision not been the very thing that ruined him. Governing, for her, became a version of the lesson Christina had practiced. Not how to eliminate intrigue, but how to lower its temperature. She failed as often as she succeeded. Spain made a profession of reminding her. Coups rehearsed themselves. Cabinets fell like poorly hung portraits. Generals grew famous for their ability to appear at the right balcony with the wrong number of friends. In 1868, the Glorious Revolution shouted the old lesson in a new octave. When rooms insist on being the government, roads and salaries and hope will plot against them. Isabella left the city that had taught her to breathe, a woman pursued by the arithmetic of factions. Yet even in exile, the mythmorphos of Ferdinand did not return to center stage. It had done its work, not to inform, but to warn. A generation of jurists and journalists carried in their sentences a skepticism of l'art apparatus that no manifesto could have tutored so well. They wrote constitutions that spent more ink on procedures than on personalities. They built ministries whose budgets could be audited. They advocated a press allowed to be tedious. Leave us our boredom, one deputy pleaded in an unguarded moment. We have been excited enough. It is not a motto to stir banners. It is a discipline to keep streets open. And the brie drawer. We return to it again, because stories like having one object to point at when the real subject is habits. Perhaps it contained drawings. Perhaps it contained nothing at all. Perhaps the only true artifact was a Kasni sentence in a physician's hand, admitting that care without mercy becomes spectacle, and that spectacle, under a crown, becomes policy. Rumor insists that the specimen, flesh turned into a teaching, still exists somewhere. The truth insists that Spain learned more from hinges than from tissue. Hinges were bought by the dozen. Hinges appeared on invoices. Hinges squeaked when they needed oil and kept their counsel the rest of the time. Hinges taught the country that what is installed can be uninstalled. There is a last image worth keeping because it arranges the themes without forcing them. A Bassancinai museum gallery in Madrid years later, long after Christina has left her cautious fingerprints on governance and Isabella has become a history problem for schoolboys. A small crowd stands before a portrait of Caco, Maria Isabel de Braganza, the second queen, the one who loved paintings and, according to some accounts, helped seed the collection that would become pride instead of palliative. A guide explains that she died young. No one mentions the cushions. A child looks up and asks why queens die so often in old stories. The guide says, because the work they were asked to do was dangerous, and moves on. No one in the room hears politics. Everyone in the room has just heard the Constitution of Austin miniature. If you insist on heroes, the story balks. If you insist on villains, it shrugs. What it offers instead is a series of corrections. Physicians who learn to prefer limits over experimentation. Clerks who learn that inventories can either protect people or indict them depending on where the copy is kept. Ministers who learned that a healthy mistrust of Haas secrecy is not disloyalty, but oxygen. Queens who learn to place ordinary things, bells, feedings, schedules, between a child and a state's appetite. Even soldiers learn something, that discipline is not the same as obedience, and that obedience to a fear makes poor soldiers of everyone. You can make of Ferdinand a monster. The archives will tolerate it, and polite discourse will congratulate itself for avoiding vulgarity. Or you can make of him a beau mirror, in which a century's reflexes are visible. How the powerful learn to convert embarrassment into policy. How churches learn to guard boxes, because sometimes that is the only way to keep crowds from misusing the contents. How nations learn, stumblingly, to prefer mobber. Law to personality, not because law is pure, but because personality is so very hungry. The old physician died, as most physicians do, in a bed that other hands had prepared. His box of letters outlived him, and then, as such boxes do, drifted into other hands and other drawers. A granddaughter married a man who disliked clutter and burned a third of the papers for the pleasure of seeing guilt behave like smoke. A historian decades later found what remained and misread it just enough to write an article that made a name for him and did no harm. Between those two fires, one literal, one reputational, Spain continued the more difficult labor of adjusting habits, turning peepholes into patched plaster, emergency into procedure, rumor into history. We promised, at the beginning, a story about a physician at a bed and the thing he was asked to preserve. We have kept 70% of that promise, the parts that can be told without making a spectacle of suffering, and we have tried to spend the remaining 30% on understanding. How a body became a imam policy. How a chamber trained a state. How a king's fear taught a country to measure the distance between mild intimacy and law. If there is a relic worth keeping, it is not flesh in a vault. It is a sentence in the civic catechism Spain wrote for itself after too much watching. Do not govern by devices. Govern by daylight. And so, the silk sheets end not as scandal, but as fabric. Laundered, ironed, repurposed into curtains that frame a window open to air. The bell at the headboard remains, its small tongue bright, to be rung by people who require help rather than permission. The hinges hold, quiet enough that rooms can be used for what rooms are for. The nation, still quarrelsome, still poor too often, still tempted by drama, steps into morning after morning, without asking the walls what they think. That is not triumph. It is maturity. It is also, for a country that once mistook apparatus for mercy, a kind of miracle. Archives keep their own calendar. They open a morning a decade late and close an afternoon a century early. They answer the question you did not know to ask and misplace the one you carried in hot from the street. Years after the First War cooled and the Second learned its steps, a young historian from Valladolid wrote to 3 custodians, Madrid, Rome, Paris, asking for the paper trail of a life turned legend. He received 3 different kinds of no: the polite, the bureaucratic, and the one that pretends you have confused doors. He learned, what every historian learns sooner or later, that refusal is itself a Maikar source. What must be protected so carefully that even the titles are dangerous. He did not give up. He changed. Angle. Instead of chasing sealed folders, he read the margins. Inventories of palace linen, locksmith ledgers, pharmacists' order books, invoices from a saddler's grandson in Aranjuez who billed for furniture supports in a hand that had learned to hide meaning inside trade. He found silences where numbers should have been, and numbers where language had probably been excised. He traced a year by the purchase of hinge oil and wrote a paragraph that said more about a monarchy than a dozen edicts. When he finally published, he did not include a single salacious phrase. He wrote about procedures, and the readers who wanted flesh skimmed and complained that nothing happened. The readers who understood government clipped the article and taught it to their students. Elsewhere, a physician in Seville, with a weakness for footnotes, tried the inverse experiment, putting words to wounds, without turning them into posters. He wrote about congenital deformities and the lakai ethics of looking, about the difference between examination and spectacle, about how a clinic can become a theater if the room's patience is spent. He cited no kings. He did not need to. His argument had the quiet clarity of a hand being withdrawn from where it does not belong. A young medical student, reading the piece on a tram surrounded by people who were not sick, decided that the best thing he could learn from history was when to stop so. Madrid turned modern, rails and lamps, and the new arrogance of steel, and the old palace learned a different role. Tourists entered where conspirators once waited. School children cooled their faces in halls that had stored heat sir no draft could ease. Guides developed the tact that is the museum's first art, how to tell enough to honor the object, and not so much that the object devours the person listening. In a room where portraits hang in ranks like rhetoric, a docent perfected a sentence that satisfied without glamorizing suffering. This queen died young. The work asked of her was dangerous. The institution learned too late. Children nodded. Adults looked at the frames a beat longer than necessary, and then moved on, lighter by some sorrow they could not have named. But buildings remember. One afternoon, a plasterer repairing a hairline crack along a corridor felt his chisel catch something not stone. He pried, gently, and revealed the blind face of a voice-filled peephole. Its brass small and stubborn, drowned in paint, but unwilling to dissolve. He called his foreman. The foreman called a curator. The curator weighed honesty against peace, and chose to leave the thing where it lay. They patched the plaster and made a small pencil mark on the plan for future repairs, a prayer to colleagues not yet hired. There is a ghost here, and we have learned to live with it. That is another kind of archive. The story, meanwhile, had migrated into metaphor. A deputy in the Cortes, arguing against a bill that would expand domestic surveillance, spoke of peepholes in the wall of the Republic, and the chamber, usually allergic to poetry, murmured approval. A journalist, weary of a minister who preferred ceremonial by locks to unglamorous budgets, wrote that Spain had once tried to govern by hinge and discovered that hinges are terrible at collecting taxes. A playwright, clever and dangerous in equal measure, set a tragedy in a household ruled by an invisible watcher and never once said the word king. The audience recognized the architecture, anyway, and left the theater glancing at the corners of their own rooms with a new, useful irritation. Every generation rediscovers the temptation of apparatus. In the age of cameras and wires and passwords, the peephole returned in stainless steel and glass, multiplied and networked, able to whisper to 1,000 ears at once. A city councilor, seduced by metrics and dashboards, proposed that if the capital could only quantify itself finely enough, the old quarrels would evaporate in data. A wry old clerk in the back of the room said softly that Madrid had tried a more intimate version of that logic when a king counted spoonfuls and heartbeats. The quarrels had not evaporated. The people had. The motion failed by 2 votes. The clerk went home, content and a little sad, the way content people often are. Not all inheritances are vices. In a ward of a public hospital, named, in a tidy irony, for a queen, a team of nurses practiced the choreography of Shri consent, as if it were a dance worth mastering. Knock, explain, ask, wait. They had been taught that the difference between care and control is not always visible to the person providing it, only to the person receiving it. One nurse kept a bell on a bedside table, an ordinary bell, nothing royal about it, and told each patient that it was to be rung when something felt wrong, even if the word for the wrongness was not yet available. An intern joked once, lightly, foolishly, about the bell as a headboard relic, and the ward matron, a woman with the moral authority of a major, said loud enough for the joke to be educational. That bell is our Constitution. Across an ocean, a scholar wrote a book about shame as a political solvent. He argued that when private mortifications are drafted into law, they corrupt both the person and the code. He did not cite Spain in his index, but Spain glinted between his lines the way a river glints between trees. A reviewer, impatient with abstractions, complained that the book lacked examples. The scholar smiled and said to a friend that sometimes examples become excuses, and excuses become voyeurism, and voyeurism always thinks it is learning. The friend asked whether he had in mind a sealed drawer in Rome. The scholar shrugged. In every city, he said, there is a sealed drawer. The trick is remembering that it is a drawer and not a shrine. As for the descendants of the people who held the instruments and the ledgers and the pens, some changed their names, some did not. A saddler's great-great-granddaughter opened a small shop near the Rastro selling leather goods, and on a quiet Tuesday, an elderly tourist examined a belt as if it were testimony. We made useful things, the shopkeeper said gently, reading the question in the customer's eyebrows. Once, a customer chose the use badly. That is on him. The tourist bought a wallet and a promise to return when he had learned to ask better questions. At long last, a packet did surface. Nothing like the Rumors Museum. Everything like a clerk's conscience. It contained no drawings, no preserved horror, only letters. A physician apologizing to a confessor for the vocabulary of his trade. A confessor forgiving him by reminding him that even mercy uses nouns. A chamberlain scolding a saddler for an invoice too explicit. The saddler replying with a euphemism so elegant it sounded like a psalm. A historian transcribed them and published with the modesty appropriate to small truths. The only sentence anyone quoted was the confessor's, "Name no more than you must, heal more than you name." It traveled farther than scandal because it offered work rather than a thrill. And the young historian from Valladolid, he aged the way researchers do, into a man whose questions had learned to listen. He no longer asked custodians to open everything. He asked them what they feared losing if a box were opened, and sometimes they opened it, and sometimes they did not. And either way, he learned something he could not have learned by demanding. He taught his students that a nation's maturity can be measured by the number of secrets it no longer needs to keep to protect faces, not to protect lies. On the last day of each term, he read them a paragraph about a bell at a bed that had been repurposed into summoning help. And he told them that constitutions are bells, not locks. You can end the story anywhere. The bed, the drawer, the handshake at Vergara, the quiet of a ward where a bell behaves itself. But perhaps the cleanest end is the one Spain earned slowly, a people who understand that daylight is not an enemy of dignity, that privacy is a right, not a covered stage, that the instruments of care become instruments of harm the moment they are asked to do politics. It is not a glamorous moral. It will not decorate a poster. It is the kind of sentence palaces dislike because it makes palaces smaller and people larger. So let the curtain fall here, if it must, with a city going about its business, with a museum guide finishing a shift without once substituting titillation for history, with a nurse setting a bell within reach and smiling because she expects never to hear it at a scream, with a clerk in Rome locking a cabinet without pride or malice, with a student on a tram underlining a phrase, "Govern by daylight," and not yet knowing that it will be the line by which she explains her country to herself when the country misbehaves again. The silk has been washed. The hinges hold without speaking. The room is finally used for what rooms are for. Living. Begin where we started. A physician in 1834. Hands steady from long practice, standing in a room where silence had been taught to behave. The work before him was narrow and impossible at once. Preserve what power had made. Unsayable. Render it into notes and jars and drawings that could be filed away where truth goes when truth embarrasses the living. He was not a monster. He was a professional inside an institution that believed learning could be wrestled from fear, pain. If everyone agreed to speak in a low voice, he finished what the palace had asked and sealed what the palace could not bear. Then he did what all witnesses must do when history changes keys. He stepped out of the light and let East politics park enter. Outside that room, the country he served staggered into the age that would never stop naming itself. Regency, war, a treaty, statute, constitution, pronunciamiento. Across decades, Spain rehearsed a single lesson in different costumes. When a Sinshinsum person mustn't pretends to be an institution, everyone else is drafted into theater. When an istani institution remembers, it is only a way of letting people breathe together. Theater yields to daylight. Ferdinand had been the first kind of ruler and the worst kind of patient. his needs too large for any room that wished to stay human. The rooms had expanded to accommodate him, and discovered, too late, that rooms expanded by fear become states. The physicians learned something from their failure that manuals never quite say aloud. They began to write with a new shyness about bodies that refuse neat forms, a respect that sounds like hesitation because it is. Diagnosis, they discovered, is not absolution. Care without my mercy is spectacle. The younger men, those who had taken notes at the foot of a royal bed and later married and held their own infants through fevers, taught their students to stop the looking. When looking ceased to be help. In an academy in Seville, a lecturer used a phrase that ought to be a prayer. Name no more than you must. Heal more than you name. A generation repeated it until it became habit rather than rhetoric. Clerks learned too. They had watched a sovereign attempt to turn ledgers into bulwarks against humiliation, and they had watched humiliation seep through paper like damp through plaster. In the ministries, a boring revolution set in. Budgets became legible. Inventories started describing things that actually existed. Locks were purchased for doors that needed locks rather than for souls that needed kindness. A modest clerk in the intendancy, whose heroism was filing cabinets that matched the laws they were meant to store, would never be commemorated in bronze. He would, however, help a country shift from secrecy to record, an improvement quiet enough to be mistaken for nothing at all. Queens did the work palaces seldom credit: rhythm. Maria Isabel had tried to fill rooms with art and ordinary light before fear taught her to stutter. Maria Josefa had held chaos at bay with a pencil and a journal, writing the body into a schedule until the body betrayed her, and the schedule became a reliquary. Christina performed governance as housekeeping, with a sword at the threshold. She closed peepholes, yes, but more importantly, she taught ours to start on time again. It is not romantic to say that a nation's first mercy is punctuality. It is true. Bells rung for prayers, and for councils, and for milk feedings. The palace remembered that a bell is an invitation, not an alarm. And the Foissey files? They had their afterlife. Some were burnt in fits of reforming zeal, paper rendered harmless by flame, and then reincarnated as rumor, which is never harmless. Some were sealed because institutions must sometimes protect the living from the dead when the dead have become currency. Some were read in good faith, footnoted with restraint, then put away with the respect due to people who couldn't consent to being examples. Out of that compromise, Spain manufactured a new craft, the art of not turning human error into policy. The discipline of letting certain doors remain closed without worshiping the closures. You can make of Ferdinand a museum, a glass case with a caption that scolds the past. Or you can make of him a tool for the present, a way to test new appetites when they arrive dressed as prudence. Each time a minister proposed another register, another inspection, another polite intrusion sold as care, someone would tell a joke about hinges, and the room would laugh, and the proposal would be trimmed until it resembled administration instead of surveillance. This, laughter deployed as guardrail, may be the healthiest memorial a country can offer to its own near ruin. If the story requires a miracle, let it be an ordinary one. A Maoyan nurse sets a bell by a patient's bed and says, "Ring when you need me," and means it. A Maoyan teacher opens a window rather than ordering silence, and discovers that air confers the discipline sermons cannot. A Judge Lescure decides a case in language boring enough that it cannot be dressed in banners. A reporter chooses not to publish a detail that would sell newspapers and harm no one except the already harmed. Small refusals of spectacle, small preferences for daylight. This is how nations heal when they have been instructed, for too long, to stare at walls. The physician who began our tale would not have called himself a philosopher. And yet, in a margin no one was meant to read, he once wrote a sentence next to a diagram. He hated drawing. Objects do not redeem us. Choices do. The palace had collected objects, cushions, straps, bottles, bells, bolts, and asked them to do theology's work, and law's work, and medicine's work. They could only do mechanics. Choices about speaking softly, about watching less, about trusting rules more than individuals, did what the objects could not. Spain's slow conversion from apparatus to habit did not make the history books noisy. It did, however, make mornings possible. There remains, for those who cannot forgive without seeing, the old hunger for the Saint-Léon sealed drawer. Perhaps it still exists in Rome or Madrid, filled with paper too meticulously cruel for publication. If it does, it condemns no one living. Its only power now is to distract. The more useful reliquary is not a box. It is a patched wall. Put your palm against the place where a peephole once was and feel, under paint, the little scar. Then ask the only political question that matters after scandal. What deserves watching? And who deserves privacy? If a country can answer that twice in one generation, once in law, once in reflex, it has survived its worst temptation. We have kept the stories facts. A king, misshapen by inheritance and amplified by fear. Wives turned into devices and then into grief. A court that tried to manage shame with carpentry. A nation that learned, with stubborn courage, to prefer law to rooms. We have also spent our permitted invention on what the facts imply. That humiliation, when institutionalized, breeds a state that humiliates. That mercy, when made ordinary, breeds a state that can be obeyed without bowing. This is not absolution for the man whose watchfulness made everyone else watched. It is an explanation for the country that outlived him. We end then, not at a bedside, but at a window. Outside, a city that quarrels, that votes badly and then better, that buries its dead without turning funerals into doctrine, that sends its children to schools with maps on the wall and bells that ring only for class. Inside, a room used for reading, for nursing, for sleep unpoliced by hinges. The silk that once covered a kingdom's nerves is now just cloth. The bell is just a bell. The files sit in archives waiting for scholars who know that knowledge, without kindness, is a form of vandalism, governed by daylight. Keep the doors that must be shut shut, and the rest open. Refuse to turn apparatus into ethics. Teach your sons a joke where your fathers taught a sneer. Teach your daughters the sound a bell makes when it invites help. Let the physician's line in the margin stand as the last caption beneath the portrait of a century. Objects do not redeem us. Choices do. The room exhales. The nation, still imperfect, still tempted, follows.